All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live, the last day of 2025. We're still on the policy of appeasement, 1931 to 1936. I'm on page 570. The Italian Assault, 1934 to 1936. Although the fascist government of Benito Mussolini talked in a truculent and vainglorious way from its ascension to power in 1922, emphasizing its determination to reestablish the glories of the Roman Empire, to dominate the Mediterranean Sea, and to achieve strategic self-sufficiency by increasing the quantity of homegrown food. Its actions were much more modest and did not go far beyond efforts to limit Yugoslav influence in the Adriatic and to overly publicize a modest increase in domestic wheat production. Wow, that was one sentence. Wow. In general, Italy's situation was similar to Japan's. Limited natural resources, especially an almost complete lack of coal or oil, combined with a rapidly falling death rate to create growing pressure of population. This problem, as in Japan, was intensified by restrictions on immigration with an E of Italians or on the outflows of Italian goods, especially after 1918. The important dates in modern Italian history are 1922, 1925, 1927, and above all, 1934. In 1922, the fascists came to power in a parliamentary system. In 1925, this parliamentary system was replaced by a political dictatorship with 19th century Latin American overtones rather than a 20th century totalitarian character, since the economic system remained that of orthodox financial capitalism in 1927 and orthodox and restricted stabilization of the lira on the international gold standard led to such depressed economic conditions that Mussolini adopted a much more active foreign policy, seeking to create an economic and political entente with the three defeated powers of Central Europe, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, in 1934. Italy replaced orthodox economic measures by a totalitarian economy functioning beneath a fraudulent corporate facade, and at the same time shifted its dynamic foreign policy from Central Europe to Africa and the Mediterranean. I mean, come on, bro. That sentence was like a paragraph. That was a paragraph, not a sentence. Europe in the period 1927 to 1934 was both anti-German and anti-Little Entente. This was an impossible combination for the division of Europe into revisionist and anti-revisionist powers, made it impossible for Italy to create a new alignment cutting through this line of conflict. By following an anti-Little Entente and pro-Hungarian policy, Mussolini was anti-French and thus inevitably pro-German, something which Mussolini never was and never wished to be. It took him 7 years, however, to realize the illogic of his position. In these 7 years, 1927 to 1934, Hungary, rather than Germany, was the most active revisionist force in history. By working with Hungary, with the reactionary elements in Austria and Bulgaria, and with dissident Croatian elements in Yugoslavia, Mussolini sought to weaken the Little Entente, especially Yugoslavia, and to create troubled waters for fascist fishing. He insisted that Italy was a dissatisfied power because of disappointment over its lack of colonial gains at Versailles in 1919 and the refusal of the League to accede to Tommaso Titone's request for a redistribution of the world's resources in accordance with population needs made in 1920. It is true that Italy's population and raw material problems were acute, but the steps taken by Mussolini offered no hope of alleviating them. Italy's Danube policy culminated in a treaty of friendship with Austria in 1930 and a series of political and economic agreements with Austria and Hungary known as the Rome Protocols in 1934. The Austrian government under Engelbert Dollfuss destroyed the democratic institutions of Austria, wiped out all socialist and working class organizations, and established a one party, dictatorial, corporative state at Mussolini's behest in February to April 1934. Hitler took advantage of this to Hitler took advantage of this to attempt a Nazi coup in Austria, murdering Dollfuss in July 1934, but he was prevented from moving into the country by the hurried mobilization of Italian troops on the Brenner frontier and a stern warning from Mussolini. The significant event revealed that Italy was the only major power prepared to fight for Austria's independence and that Mussolini's 7 years of work for the revisionist cause had been a mistake. It was, however, a mistake from which the Duce learned nothing. Instead, he condoned an assassination plot by extreme revisionist elements, including the Bulgarian IMRO, Croatian separatist, and Hungarian extremists. This resulted in the murder of Alexander, the centralist Serb king of Yugoslavia, and John Louis Barthou, the foreign minister of France, at Marseille in October 1934. Hitler's ascension to office in Germany in January 1933 found French foreign policy paralyzed by British opposition to any efforts to support collective security or to enforce German observation of its treaty obligations by force. As a result, a suggestion from Poland in April 1933 for joint armed intervention in Germany to remove Hitler from office was rejected by France. Poland at once made a non-aggression pact with Germany and extended a previous non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union January through May 1934. This inaugurated a policy of balancing between these two great powers, which left Poland ripe for the Fourth Partition, which came in 1939. After the advent to office in France of a new conservative coalition government with Jean Louis Barthou as foreign minister in February 1934, France began to adopt a more active policy against Hitler. This policy sought to encircle Germany by bringing the Soviet Union and Italy into a revived alignment of France, Poland, the Little Entente, Greece, and Turkey. A Balkan Pact of Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey was concluded as early as February 1934. French relations with the Little Entente were tightened as a consequence of visits by Barthou to various capitals. Russia was brought into the League of Nations in September 1934. A French-Italian agreement was signed in January 1935, a common front against German rearmament, which had been announced in March, was made by France, Italy, and Britain at the Stresa Conference in April 1935, and Germany's actions was denounced by the League of Nations the same week. Yeah, his wife is really slacking on the grammar. And German, that's on page 572. And Germany's apostrophe s actions was denounced by the League of Nations the same week. Okay. And Germany's actions were denounced by the League of Nations the same week. A French-Soviet alliance and a Czech-Soviet alliance were made in May 1935, the latter to be binding on Russia only after the earlier French-Czech alliance went into effect. In the course of building this united front against Germany, but before Italy had been brought into it, Bartho and King Alexander were assassinated at Marseille, as we have indicated, October 1934. This did not stop the project, for Pierre Laval took Barthot's place and carried out his predecessor's plans, although much less effectively. It was, accordingly, Pierre Laval who brought Italy into this arrangement in January 1935 and the Soviet Union in May 1935. Laval was convinced that Italy could be brought into the anti-German front only if its long-standing grievances and unfulfilled ambitions in Africa could be met. Accordingly, Laval gave Mussolini 7% of the stock of the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway, which ran from French Somaliland to from French Somaliland on the Red Sea to the capital of Ethiopia, a stretch of desert 114,000 miles in extent but containing only a few hundred persons. 62, according to Mussolini himself, on the border of Libya, a small wedge of territory between French Somaliland and Italian Eritrea. Or what is it called? I forget what. Yeah, it is called Eritrea. And Italian Eritrea, a settlement of the citizenship and education status of Italian immigrants in French Tunisia, and the right to ask for concessions throughout Ethiopia. This last point was an important one because while Laval insisted that he made no agreement which jeopardized Ethiopia's independence or territorial integrity, he made it equally clear that the Italian support against Germany was more important than the integrity of Ethiopia in his eyes. France had been Ethiopia's only real friend for many years. It had engineered a tripartite agreement of Britain, Italy, and France to permit no change in Ethiopia's status without a tripartite consent in 1906, and had brought Ethiopia into the League of Nations over British objections in 1923. Italy, on the other hand, had been prevented from conquering Ethiopia in 1896 only by a decisive defeat of her invading force at the hands of the Ethiopians themselves, while in 1925 Britain and Italy had cut Ethiopia up into economic spheres by an agreement which was annulled by a French appeal to the League of Nations. Laval's renunciation of France's traditional support of Ethiopian independence and integrity was thus of great importance and brought the three governments concerned, Italy, Britain, and France, into an agreement on this issue. This point of view, however, was not shared by public opinion in these three countries. In France, opinion was too divided to allow us to make any categorical statements about its nature, but it is probable that a majority was in favor. Yeah. Okay. But it is probable, that's on page 573 now, but it is probable that a majority were in favor of extending collective security to Ethiopia, while an overwhelming majority were, not was, were convinced that Germany should be the primary object of this instrument of international action. In Italy, it is likely that a majority opposed both Mussolini's war on Ethiopia and the League's efforts to stop this by economic sanctions. In England, an overwhelming majority was in support. Come on. Like, that's if it's plural, An overwhelming majority is plural. An overwhelming majority were in support of the League of Nations and sanctions against Italy. This was clear from the so-called peace ballot of 1935, which, on the basis of privately conducted straw vote of the English electorate, showed that 11.5 million polled, that of 11.5 million polled, over 11 million supported membership in the League, over 10 million supported economic sanctions, and over 6.7 million supported, while only 2.3 million opposed, military sanctions against aggressors. This point of view was opposed by the pacifist left wing of the Labour Party and by the imperialist right wing of the Conservative Party. It was also opposed by the British government itself. Sir John Simon, the Foreign Secretary, Sir Bolton Ayres Monsell, the First Lord of Admiralty, and Stanley Baldwin, leader of the party and Prime Minister, denounced the peace ballot and its collective security basis while the polling was in process, but hastened to give their verbal support as soon as the results became evident. Baldwin, who in November 1934 had declared that a collective peace system was perfectly impracticable, assured the organizers of the ballot that the foreign policy of the government is founded upon the League of Nations, when the results were revealed in July 1935. On this basis was erected one of the most astonishing examples of British dual policy in the appeasement period. While publicly supporting collective security and sanctions against Italian aggressors, the government privately negotiated to destroy the League and to yield Ethiopia to Italy. They were completely successful in this secret policy. The Italian aggressors against Ethiopia began with an incursion into Ethiopian territory at Wal Wal in December 1934 and broke into full-scale invasion in October 1935. That Italy had no real fear of British military sanctions against them was evident when they put a major part of their military forces, transports, and naval strength in the Red Sea, separated from home by the British-controlled Suez Canal and the massed British fleet at Alexandria. Their use of the Suez Canal to transport munitions and troops naturally revealed their aggressive intentions to Britain at an early stage. The British government's position on Ethiopia was clearly stated in a secret report of an interdepartmental committee under Sir John Maffei. The report, presented to the Foreign Secretary on June 18, 1935, declared that Italian control of Ethiopia would be a matter of indifference to Britain. This report was mysteriously and surreptitiously conveyed to the Italians and undiplomatically published by them later. There can be no doubt that it represented the opinion of the British government and that this opinion was shared by the French government. Unfortunately, public opinion in both countries and throughout most of the world was insisting on collective sanctions against the aggressor. To meet this demand, both governments engaged in a public policy of unenforced or partially enforced sanctions at wide variance with their real intentions. In consequence, they lost both Ethiopia and Italy, the former by their real policy, the latter by their public policy. In the process, they gave the League of Nations, the collective security system, and the political stability of Central Europe their death wounds. Taking advantage of the wave of public support for collective security, Samuel Hoare, now Foreign Secretary, went to the meeting of the Assembly of the League of Nations in September 1935 and delivered a smashing speech to support of the League, collective security, and sanctions against Italy. The day previously, he and Anthony Eden had secretly agreed with Pierre Laval to impose only partial economic sanctions, avoiding all action, such as blockade or closure of the Suez Canal, which might lead to war. A number of governments, including Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, and Britain, had stopped all export of munitions to Ethiopia as early as May and June 1935, although Ethiopia's appeal to the League of Nations for help had been made on March 17th, while the Italian attack did not come until October 2nd, 1935. The net result was that Ethiopia was left defenseless in the face of an aggressor who was annoyed without being sensibly hampered by incomplete and late economic sanctions. Ethiopia's appeal for neutral observers on June 19th was never acknowledged, and her appeal to the United States for support under the Kellogg-Briand Pact on July 3rd was at once rejected, but Eden found time to offer Mussolini a portion of Ethiopia as part of a deal which would avoid an open Italian aggression June 24th. The Duce was determined, however, to commit an open aggression as the only method for achieving that modicum of Roman glory for which he thirsted. Hoare's speech in support of collective security at Geneva in September evoked such applause from British public that Baldwin decided to hold a general election on that issue. Accordingly, with a ringing pledge to support collective action and collective security, and to take no action in isolation, the national government offered itself at the polls on November 14, 1935, and won an amazing victory. The government's margin of 431 seats out of 615 kept it in power until the next general election 10 years later, July 1945. Although Article 16 of the League Covenant bound the signers to break off all trade and financial relations with an aggressor, France and Britain combined to keep their economic sanctions partial and ineffective. Imposed on November 18, 1935, and accepted by 52 nations, these sanctions established an embargo in arms and munitions, on loans and on credit, and on certain key commodities, and established a boycott on purchases of all Italian goods. The embargoes did not cover iron ore, coal, or petroleum products, although the last item, of which Italy had less than a 2-month supply in October 1935, would have stopped the Italian aggression quickly and completely. The imposition of oil sanctions was postponed time and again until by the spring of 1936, the conquest of Ethiopia was completed. This was done in spite of the fact that as early as December 12th, 10 states, which had been supplying 3/4 of Italy's oil needs, volunteered to support the embargo. The refusal to establish this sanction resulted from a joint British-French refusal on the grounds that an oil sanction would be so effective that Italy would be compelled to break off its war with Ethiopia and would, in desperation, make war on Britain and France. This, at least, was the amazing logic offered by the British government later. Instead of additional or effective sanctions, Samuel Hoare and Pierre Laval worked out a secret deal which would have given Italy outright about 1/6 of Ethiopia and have yielded an additional third as a zone of economic expansion and settlement reserved to Italy. When the news of this deal was broken to the public by a French journalist on December 10, 1935, there was a roar of protest from the supporters of collective security, especially in England, on the grounds that this violated the election pledge made but a month previously. To save his government, Baldwin had to sacrifice Hoare, who resigned on December 19th but returned to the cabinet on June 5th, 1936, as soon as Ethiopia was decently buried. Laval in France survived the first parliamentary assault but fell from office in January 1936. He was succeeded at Quai d'Orsay by Pierre Flandin, who pursued the same policy. Ethiopia was conquered on May 2, 1936, and annexed to Italy a week later. Sanctions were removed by the various cooperating states and by the League itself in the next 2 months, just as they were beginning to take effect. The consequences of the Ethiopian fiasco were of the greatest importance. Mussolini was much strengthened in Italy by his apparent success in acquiring an empire in the face of the economic barrage of 52 nations. The Conservative Party in England was entrenched in office for a decade, during which it carried out its policy of appeasement and waged the resulting war. The United States was driven by panic to pass a Neutrality Act, which encouraged aggression by its provision that the outbreak of war would cut off supplies of American munitions to both sides, to the aggressor who had aimed at his leisure, and to the victim yet unarmed. Above all, the Ethiopian crisis destroyed French efforts to encircle Germany. Britain had opposed these efforts from the beginning and was able to block them with the aid of a number of other factors for which Britain was not primarily responsible. This point is sufficiently important to demand detailed analysis. Circles and Counter Circles, 1935 to 1939. Laval's agreement in January 1935 with Mussolini had been intended to bring Italy to the side of France in the face of Germany, a goal which seemed perfectly possible in the light of Mussolini's veto on Hitler's coup in Austria in July 1934. This result would have been achieved if Ethiopia could have been taken by Italy without League action. In that case, Mussolini argued, Africa would have been removed from the sphere of the League's action as North America had been in 1919 by the Monroe Doctrine Amendment to the Covenant, and Asia had been in 1931 by the failure to take action against Japan. This would have left the League as a purely European organization, according to Mussolini. This view was regarded with favor in France, where the chief, if not the sole, role of the League was to provide security against Germany. This view was completely unacceptable to Britain, which wanted no exclusively European political organization and could not join one herself because of her imperial obligations and her preference for an Atlantic organization, including the Dominions and the United States. Thus, Britain insisted on sanctions against Italy, but the British government never wanted collective security to be a success. As a result, the French desire for no sanctions combined with the British desire for ineffective sanctions to provide ineffective sanctions. What? As a result, the French desire for no sanctions combined with the British desire for ineffective sanctions to provide ineffective sanctions? What? That doesn't even make any sense. On page 577, that sentence doesn't make any sense. Because there were sanctions, France lost Italian support against Germany. Because they were ineffective, France lost the League's system of collective security against Germany as well. Thus, France had neither bread nor cake. Worse than that, the Italian involvement in Africa withdrew Italian political power from Central Europe and thus removed the chief force ready to resist German penetration of Austria. Still worse, the hubbub of the Ethiopian crisis gave Hitler an opportunity to declare the rearmament of Germany, and the reestablishment of the German Air Force in March 1935, and to remilitarize the Rhineland on March 7, 1936. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, in violation of the Versailles Treaty and the Locarno Pact, was the most important result of the Ethiopian crisis and the most important event of the period of appeasement. It greatly reduced France's own security and reduced even more the security of France's allies to the east of Germany because once this zone was fortified, it could decrease greatly France's ability to come to the aid of Eastern Europe. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was the essential military prerequisite for any movement of Germany eastward against Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, or the Soviet Union. That such a movement was the chief aim of Hitler's policy had been clearly and explicitly stated by him throughout his public life. German rearmament had proceeded so slowly that Germany had only 25 paper divisions in 1936, and the German generals demanded and obtained written orders to retreat if France made any move to invade the Rhineland. No such move was made, although Germany had less than 30,000 troops in the area. This failure arose from a combination of two factors. One, the expense of a French mobilization, which would have required the devaluation of the franc at the time when France was working with desperate energy to preserve the value of the franc. And two, the objections of Britain, which refused to allow France to take military action or to impose any sanction, even economic, against Germany, or to use Italy, against whom economic sanctions were still in force, in the field against Germany, as provided in the Locarno Pacts. Yeah, these parentheses sentences are like ridiculous. Like, just make another sentence, man. In a violent scene with Flandin on March 12th, Neville Chamberlain rejected sanctions and refused to accept Flandin's argument that if a firm front is maintained by France and England, Germany will yield without war. Hold on 1 second, I gotta take this letter. Chamberlain's refusal to enforce the Locarno Pacts when they fell due was not his personal policy or anything new. It was the policy of the Conservative Party and had been for years. As early as July 13, 1934, Sir Austen Chamberlain had stated publicly that Britain would not use troops to enforce the Rhineland clauses and would use its veto power in the Council of the League to prevent this by others under the Locarno Pacts. The remilitarization of the Rhineland also detached Belgium from the anti-German circle. Alarmed by the return of German troops to its border and the failure of the British-Italian guarantee of Locarno, Belgium, in October 1936, denounced its alliance with France and adopted a policy of strict neutrality. This made it impossible for France to extend its fortification system, the Maginot Line, which was being built on the French-German border, along the Belgian-German border. Moreover, since France was convinced that Belgium would be on its side in any future war with Germany, the line was not extended along the French-Belgian border either. It was across this unfortified border that Germany attacked France in 1940. Thus, Barthot's efforts to encircle Germany were largely but not completely destroyed in the period 1934 to 1936 by four events. 1. The loss of Poland in January 1934. 2. The loss of Italy by January 1936. 3. The rearmament of Germany and the remilitarization of the Rhineland by March 1936. And 4. The loss of Belgium by October 1936. The chief items left in the Bartho system were the French and Soviet alliances with Czechoslovakia and with each other. In order to destroy these alliances, Britain and Germany sought on parallel paths to encircle France and the Soviet Union in order to dissuade France from honoring its alliances with either Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union. To honor these alliances, France required two things as an absolute minimum. 1. That military cooperation against Germany be provided by Britain from the first moment of any French action against Germany, and 2. That France have military security on her non-German frontiers. Both of these essentials were destroyed by Britain in the period 1935 to 1936, and, in consequence, France, finding itself encircled, dishonored its alliance with Czechoslovakia when it came due in September 1938. The encirclement of France had 6 items in it. The first was the British refusal from 1919 to 1939 to give France any promise of support against Germany in fulfillment of the French alliances with Eastern Europe, or to engage in any military commitments in support of such alliances. On the contrary, Britain made clear to France at all times her opposition to these alliances, and that action under them was not covered by any promises Britain had made to support France against a German attack westward, or by any military discussion which arose from any Anglo-French efforts to resist such an attack. This distinction was the motivation of the Locarno Pacts and explains the refusal of Britain to engage in military conversations with France until the summer of 1938. The British attitude towards Eastern Europe was made perfectly clear on many occasions. For example, on July 13, 1934, Foreign Secretary Sir John Simon denounced Barthow's efforts to create an Eastern Locarno and demanded arms equality for Germany. The other 5 items in the encirclement of France were 1. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935. 2. The alienation of Italy over sanctions. 3. The remilitarization of the Rhineland by Germany with British acquiescence and approval. 4. The neutrality of Belgium. And 5. The alienation of Spain. We have already discussed all these except the last, and have indicated the vital role which Britain played in all of them except Belgium. Taken together, they changed the French military position so drastically that France, by 1938, found herself in a position where she could hardly expect to fulfill her military obligations to Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. This was exactly the position in which the British government wished France to be, a fact made completely clear by the recently published secret documents. In May of 1935, France could have acted against Germany with all her forces because the Rhineland was unfortified and there was no need to worry about the Italian, Spanish, or Belgian frontiers or the Italian Atlantic coastline. By the end of 1938, and even more by 1939, the Rhineland was protected by the new German fortified Siegfried Line. Parts of the French army had to be left on the unfriendly Italian and Spanish frontiers and along the lengthy neutral Belgian frontier, and the Atlantic coastline could not be protected against the new German fleet unless Britain cooperated with France. This need for British cooperation on the sea arose from 2 facts. A. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935 allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of the British Navy, while France was restricted to 33% of Britain's strength in the chief categories of vessels, and B, the Italian occupation of the Balearic Islands and parts of Spain itself after the opening of the Spanish War in July 1936 required much of the French fleet to stay in the Mediterranean in order to keep open the transportation of troops and food from North Africa to metropolitan France. The details of the Spanish War will be discussed in the next chapter, but at this point, it must be realized that the shift in the control of Spain from pro-French to anti-French hands was of vital importance to Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union as a factor in determining whether the French alliances with these two would be fulfilled when the German attack came. Parallel with the encirclement of France went the encirclement of the Soviet Union and, to a lesser extent of Czechoslovakia. The encirclement of the Soviet Union was known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. This was a union of Germany and Japan against communism and the Third International. It was signed in November 1936 and was joined by Italy a year later. Manchukuo and Hungary joined in February 1939, while Spain came in a month after that. The last counter circle was that against Czechoslovakia. Hungary on the Czechoslovak southern frontier and Germany on its northwestern frontier were both opposed to Czechoslovakia as an artificial creation of the Versailles Conference. The German annexation of Austria in March 1938 closed the gap in the anti-Czech circle on the west, while the aggressive designs of Poland after 1932 completed the circle everywhere except on the insignificant Romanian frontier in the extreme east. Although the Czechs offered the Poles a treaty and even a military alliance on 3 occasions in 1932 to 1933, they were ignored, and the Polish-German agreement of January 1934 opened a campaign of vilification of Czechoslovakia by Poland, which continued parallel to the similar German campaign until the Polish invasion of Czechoslovakia in October 1938. Of these 3 counter-circles to Barthow's efforts to encircle Germany, the most significant by far was the encirclement of France, which alone made the other 2 possible. This encirclement of France, the most important factor, without which it could never have been achieved, was the encouragement of Britain. Accordingly, we must say a word about the motivations of Britain and the reactions of France. Any analysis of the motivations of Britain in 1938 to 1939 is bound to be difficult because different people had different motives. Motives changed in the course of time. The motives of the government were clearly not the same as the motives of the people, and in no country has secrecy and anonymity been carried so far or been so well preserved as in Britain. In general, motives become vaguer and less secret as we move our attention from the innermost circles of the government outward. As if we were looking at layers of an onion, we may discern 4 points of view. 1. The anti-Bolshevik at the center. 2. The 3-block world supporters close to the center. 3. The supporters of appeasement. And 4. The peace at any price group in a peripheral position. The anti-Bolsheviks, who were also anti-French, were extremely important from 1919 to 1926, but then decreased to little more than a lunatic fringe, rising again in numbers and influence after 1934 to dominate the real policy of the government in 1939. In the earlier period, the chief figures in this group were Lord Curzon, Lord D'Aberon, and General Smuts. They did what they could to destroy reparations, permit German rearmament, and tear down what they called French militarism. This point of view was supported by the second group, which was known in those days as the Round Table Group, and came later to be called, somewhat inaccurately, the Cliveden Set, after the country estate of Lord and Lady Astor. It included Lord Milner, Leopold Amory, and Edward Grigg, as well as Lord Lothian Smuts, Lord Astor, Lord Brand, brother-in-law of Lady Astor and managing director of Lazard Brothers, the international bankers, Lionel Curtis, Jeffrey Dawson, editor of the Times, and their associates. This group wielded great influence because it controlled the Rhodes Trust, the Beat Trust, the Times of London, the Observer, the influential and highly anonymous quarterly review known as the Round Table, founded in 1910, with the money supplied by Sir Abe Bailey and the Rhodes Trust, and with Lothian as editor, and it dominated the Royal Institute of International Affairs, called Chatham House, of which Sir Abe Bailey and the Astors were the chief financial supporters, while Lionel Curtis was the actual founder, the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust, and All Souls College in Oxford. That sentence was a paragraph. It has like 4 or 5 parentheses sections in it. One parentheses section is longer than a sentence. Like, bro, this is ridiculous. Like, how many lines was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so that sentence was 8 lines, and this one's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 lines for that one. Ridiculous. This roundtable group formed the core of the three-bloc world supporters and differed from the anti-Bolsheviks like D'Aberon in that they sought to contain the Soviet Union between a German-dominated Europe and an English-speaking bloc rather than to destroy it as the anti-Bolsheviks wanted. Relationships between the two groups were very close and friendly, and some people like Smuts were in both. The anti-Bolsheviks, including D'Abernon, Smuts, and John Simon, and H.A.L. Fisher, warden of All Souls College, were willing to go to any extreme to tear down France and to build up Germany. Their point of view can be found in many places, and most empathetically in a letter of August 11, 1920, from D'Abernon to Sir Maurice, later Lord Hankey, a protege of Lord Esher, who wielded great influence in the interwar period as secretary to the cabinet and secretary to almost every international conference on reparations from Genoa 1922 to Lausanne 1932. D'Abernon advocated a secret alliance of Britain with the German military leaders in cooperating against the Soviet. As ambassador of Great Britain in Berlin in 1920 to 1926, D'Abernon carried on this policy and blocked all efforts by the Disarmament Commission to disarm or even inspect Germany, according to Brigadier J.H. Morgan of the Commission. The point of view of this group was presented by General Smuts in a speech of October 23, 1923, made after a luncheon with H.A.L. Fisher. From these two groups came the Dawes Plan and the Locarno Pacts. It was Smuts, according to Stresemann, who first suggested the Locarno policy, and it was D'Abernon who became its chief supporter. H.A.L. Fisher and John Simon in the House of Commons, and Lothian, Dawson, and their friends on the Round Table, and the Times prepared the ground among the British governing class for both the Dawes Plan and Locarno as early as 1923. The Round Table for March 1923. The speeches of Fisher and Simon in the House of Commons on February 19, 1923, Fisher's speech of March 6th and Simon's speech of March 13th in the same place, the Round Table for June 1923. That was a parenthesis, and Smut's speech of October 23rd. Just if you're going to put a parenthesis at the end of a sentence, you might as well just make it a new sentence. The more moderate Round Table group, including Lionel Curtis, Leopold Amory, who was the shadow of Lord Milner, Lord Lothian, Lord Brand, and Lord Astor, sought to weaken the League of Nations and destroy all possibility of collective security in order to strengthen Germany in respect to both France and the Soviet Union. Above all, to free Britain from Europe in order to build up an Atlantic bloc of Great Britain, British dominions, and the United States. They prepared the way for this union through the Rhodes Scholarship Organization, of which Lord Milner was the head 1905 to 1925, and Lord Lothian was secretary 1925 to 1940, through the Round Table groups, which had been set up in the United States, India, and the British dominions in 1910 to 1917, through the Chatham House organizations, which set up Royal Institutes of International Affairs in all the dominions, and the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, as well as through unofficial Commonwealth relations conferences held irregularly, and the Institutes of Pacific Relations set up in various countries as autonomous branches of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. This influential group sought to change the League of Nations from an instrument of collective security to an international conference center for non-political matters like drug control or international postal services, to rebuild Germany as a buffer against the Soviet Union and a counterpoise to France, and to build up an Atlantic bloc of Britain, the dominions, the United States, and, if possible, the Scandinavian countries. One of the effusions of this group was the project called Union Now, and later Union Now with Great Britain, propagated in the United States in 1938 to 1945 by Clarence Strait on behalf of Lord Lothian and the Rhodes Trust. Ultimately, the inner circle of this group arrived at the idea of the three-block world. It was believed that this system could force Germany to keep the peace after it absorbed Europe, because it would be squeezed between the Atlantic bloc and the Soviet Union, while the Soviet Union could be forced to keep the peace because it would be squeezed between Japan and Germany. This plan would work only if Germany and the Soviet Union could be brought into contact with each other by abandoning to Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Polish corridor. This became the aim of both the anti-Bolshevik and the three-block people from the early part of 1937 to the end of 1939, or even early 1940. These two cooperated and dominated the government in that period. They split in the period 1939 to 1940 with the three-block people, like Armory, Lord Halifax, and Lord Lothian, becoming increasingly anti-German, while the anti-Bolshevik crowd like Chamberlain, Horace Wilson, and John Simon tried to adopt a policy based on a declared but unfought war against Germany combined with an undeclared fighting war against the Soviet Union. The split between these two groups appeared openly in public and led to Chamberlain's fall from office once Armory cried to Chamberlain across the floor of the House of Commons on May 10th in 1940, "In the name of God, go." Outside of these two groups, and much more numerous, but much more remote from the real instruments of government, were the appeasers and the peace at any price people. These were both used by the two inner groups to command public support for their quite different policies. Of the two, the appeasers were much more important than the peace at any price people. The appeasers swallowed the steady propaganda, much of it emanating from Chatham House, the Times, the Round Table groups, or Rhodes circles, that the Germans had been deceived and brutally treated in 1919. All right, I'm going to put a post-it note there because it's basically like these guys were the ones that were really pushing Germany into the war. For example, it was under pressure from 7 persons, including General Smuts and H.A.L. Fisher, as well as Lord Milner himself, that Lloyd George made his belated demand on June 2, 1919, that the German reparations be reduced and the Rhineland occupation be cut from 15 years to 2. The memorandum from which Lloyd George read these demands was apparently drawn up by Philip Kerr, Lord Lothian, while the minutes of the Council of Four, from which we got the record of those demands, were taken down by Sir Maurice Hankey as Secretary to the Supreme Council, a position obtained through Lord Esher. It was Kerr, Lothian, who served as British member of the Committee of Five, which drew up the answer to the Germans' protest of May 1919. General Smuts was still refusing to sign the treaty because it was too severe as late as June 23, 1919. As a result of these attacks and a barrage of similar attacks on the treaty, which continued year after year, the British public opinion acquired a guilty conscience about the Treaty of Versailles and was quite unprepared to take any steps to enforce it by 1930. On this feeling, which owed so much to the British idea of sportsmanlike conduct towards a beaten opponent, was built the movement for appeasement. This movement had two basic assumptions. A, that reparation must be made for Britain's treatment of Germany in 1919, and B, that if Germany's most obvious demands, such as arms equality, remilitarization of the Rhineland, and perhaps union with Austria, were met, Germany would become satisfied and peaceful. The trouble with this argument was that once Germany reached this point, it would be very difficult to prevent Germany from going further, such as taking the Sudetenland and the Polish corridor. Accordingly, many of the appeasers, when this point was reached in March 1938, went over to the anti-Bolshevik or three-block point of view, while some even went into the peace at any price group. It is likely that Chamberlain, Sir John Simon, and Sir Samuel Hoare went by this road from appeasement to anti-Bolshevism. At any rate, few influential people were still in the appeasement group by 1939 in the sense that they believed that Germany could ever be satisfied. Once this was realized, it seemed to many that the only solution was to bring Germany into contact with, or even collision with, the Soviet Union. The peace at any price people were both few and lacking in influence in Britain, while the contrary as we shall see, was true in France. However, in the period August 1935 to March 1939, and especially in September 1938, the government built upon the fears of this group by steadily exaggerating Germany's armed might and belittling their own by calculated indiscretions, like the statement in September 1938 that there were no real anti aircraft defenses in London. By constant hammering at the danger of an overwhelming air attack without warning, by building ostentatious and quite useless air raid trenches in the streets and parks of London, and by insisting through daily warnings that everyone must be fitted with a gas mask immediately, although the dangers of a gas attack was nil. It's kind of like how it was during like 9/11, where they kept on just changing the like terror warnings. Like it's like, oh, today it's like a level 5 terror warning, but nothing was gonna happen. It's like, oh, we got this chart. Oh, today it's like a level 4. It never was 0 though. There was never a day where it was like a 0 level terror warning. It was always like going in between 4 and 5. It was like, oh, it's a high terror warning day today. Like they've been doing this stuff forever. It's ridiculous. In this way, the government put London into a panic in 1938 for the first time since 1804 or even 1678. And by this panic, Chamberlain was able to get the British people to accept the destruction of Czechoslovakia, wrapping it up in a piece of paper marked Peace in Our Time, which he obtained from Hitler, as he confided that the ruthless dictator for British public opinion. Once this panic passed, Chamberlain found it impossible to get the British public to follow his program, although he himself never wavered, even in 1940. He worked on the appeasement and the peace at any price groups throughout 1939, but their numbers dwindled rapidly, and since he could not openly appeal for support on either the anti-Bolshevik or the three-block basis, he had to adopt the dangerous expedient of pretending to resist in order to satisfy the British public, while really continuing to make every possible concession to Hitler, which would bring Germany to a common frontier with the Soviet Union, all while putting every pressure on Poland to negotiate and on Germany to refrain from using force in order to gain time to wear Poland down and in order to avoid the necessity of backing up by action his pretense of resistance to Germany. This policy went completely astray in the period from August 1939 to April 1940. Chamberlain's motives were not bad ones. He wanted peace so that he could devote Britain's limited resources to social welfare. But he was narrow and totally ignorant of the realities of power, convinced that international policies could be conducted in terms of secret deals, as business was, and he was quite ruthless in carrying out his aims, especially his readiness to sacrifice non-English persons who, in his eyes, did not count. In the meantime, both the people and the government were more demoralized in France than in England. The policy of the right, which would have used force against Germany, even in the face of British disapproval, ended in 1924. When Bartho, who had been one of the chief figures in the 1924 effort, tried to revive it in 1934, it was quite a different thing, and he had constantly to give at least verbal support to Britain's efforts to modify his encirclement of Germany into a four-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. This four-power pact, which was the ultimate goal of the anti-Bolshevik group in England, was really an effort to form a united front of Europe against the Soviet Union, and, in the eyes of this group, would have been a capstone to unite in one system the encirclement of France, which was the British answer to Barthow's encirclement of Germany, and the anti-Comintern Pact, which was the German response to the same project. The Four-Power Pact reached its fruition at the Munich Conference of September 1938, where these four powers destroyed Czechoslovakia without consulting Czechoslovakia's ally, the Soviet Union. But the scorn the dictators had for Britain and France as decadent democracies had by this time reached such a pass that the dictators no longer had that minimum of respect which the Four-Power Pact could not function. As a consequence, Hitler in 1939 spurned all Chamberlain's frantic efforts to restore the Four-Power Pact, along with his equally frantic and even more secret efforts to win Hitler's attention by offers of colonies in Africa and economic support in Eastern Europe. As a result of the failures of the policy of the French right against Germany in 1924 and the failure of the policy of fulfillment of the French left in 1929 to 1930, France was left with no policy. Convinced that the French security depended on British military and naval support in the field before action began, in order to avoid a German wartime occupation of the richest part of France, such as existed in 1914 to 1918, depressed by the growing unbalance of German population over the French population and shot through with pacifism and anti-war feeling, the French army under Petain's influence adopted a purely defensive strategy and built up defensive tactics to support it. In spite of the agitations of Charles de Gaulle, then a colonel, and his parliamentary spokesman, Paul Reynaud, to build up an armored striking force as an offensive weapon, France built a great and purely defensive fortified barrier from Montemdy to the Swiss frontier and retrained many of its tactical units into purely defensive duties within this barrier. It was clear to many that the defensive tactics of this Maginot Line were inconsistent with France's obligations to her allies in Eastern Europe, but everyone was too paralyzed by domestic political partisanship, by British pressure for a purely Western European policy, and by general intellectual confusion and crisis weariness due to anything about bringing France's strategic plans and its political obligations into a consistent pattern. It was the purely defensive nature of these strategic plans, added to Chamberlain's veto on sanctions, which prevented Flandin from acting against Germany at the time of remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936. By 1938 and 1939, these influences had spread demoralization and panic into most parts of French society, with the results that the only feasible plan for France seemed to be to cooperate with Britain in a purely defensive policy in the West behind the Maginot Line, with a free hand for Hitler in the East. The steps which brought France to this destination are clear. They are marked by the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935, the Ethiopian Crisis of September 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, the neutralization of Belgium in 1936, the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, the destruction of Austria in March 1938, and the Czechoslovak crisis leading up to Munich in September 1938. Along these steps, we must continue our story. All right, I think we're good there. The next section is going to be the Spanish tragedy, 1931 to 1939. The link to the PDF is in the description below. Now, looking at that section, we can see again that Britain is really like the main culprit in World War II because they kept on wanting to rearm Germany. And we can also see that, all these policies are carried out in secret behind closed doors while the politicians, the elected politicians, will basically say anything to the public to keep them from revolting against the government. While in the background, they're doing the exact opposite and exactly what people voted for them to not do. People say, hey, we want to, deport all the immigrants. They bring in more immigrants while saying that they're going to deport they can just go up there and say anything they want. Because like we saw, you can't give them a lie detector test. You can't sue them for lying, right? So what's the point of even listening to what they have to say? Because they can literally say anything that they want and do the exact opposite, right? And then like in the last section, the United States section, we can see that basically capitalism has been BS the whole time, except for like mercantile capitalism, which lasted for a short period of time. But once you get into like financial capitalism or monopoly capitalism, right? The fact that you have to give out welfare, right, proves that capitalism doesn't work. Because the whole theory of capitalism is that essentially at a certain point, every person that was willing to work a job should be able to financially support themselves. But the fact that the way that capitalism actually works is that it just concentrates wealth into smaller and smaller groups of people, right, proves that it never can work, right? And I know libertarians want to say, oh, well, but a monopoly can never form, but it can form because basically all monopoly is when an industry needs so much centralization of resources, right? Like say, for instance, like they're talking about the telephone company. There's no way to coordinate that much stuff over such a large area like the United States without basically, even if like let's say there was no government control of AT&T, AT&T would just effectively become a government, right? Like the railroads would just effectively become a government because they're the only people that have the resources to do it. Like modern example, look at Google. Google is basically a government. It's basically its own nation with its own laws. And when you visit Google, you have to follow their rules and their laws. And they're the only company that has enough money to maintain the entire infrastructure that we use, right? So even though technically it's a free market and other companies can start their own business, it's practically impossible because they will never be able to gain enough market share to get enough resources to provide the infrastructure that Google does, right? There's no way to catch up to a company that already has a monopoly. Like, yeah, you can make a smaller little pocket and whatever. There's small companies that take up a tiny 0.00000% fraction of market share, but it's like Google has like 90% of it, right? So it effectively just becomes its own government anyway, right? So that's where libertarianism gets kind of stupid, because if like, right, it's just like the military. All the military is just gun companies. That's what the military is, right? The military is Smith and Wesson, it's Carbine, it's freaking the people at Halliburton, the people that make bombs and stuff like that. It's what's it called? The airline manufacturers, whatever, all the airplane manufacturers and stuff, right? They effectively are the military. They are the military. The military is just the weapons manufacturers and the people that enlist in the military, right? So it's all just a monopoly. They're all just monopolies, right? Because there's no way that some guy in his backyard can make a F-16 fighter or F-15 fighter, right? I mean, with 3D printers nowadays, yeah, you can make like a carbine or something like that, but still, it's pretty expensive to get one of the 3D printers that cuts metal. Because like making a plastic ghost gun, it only lasts like a couple shots because it's made out of plastic, and it heats up, and then the barrel melts, and all this other stuff happens to it. So that's not a real thing, right? Like 3D printing guns out of plastic is not a real thing. I'm sorry. Like you can use them a couple shots, but yeah, trying to make like a carbine out of plastic, bro, like it's not gonna work. So effectively, those companies become monopolies, right? The military becomes a monopoly. All the weapons manufacturers become the military, right? There's just like Jeff Bezos, right? He is the CIA because he's the only person that has the infrastructure to create all the AI computers and all this other stuff that the CIA needs in order to scan and monitor everybody, right? So then he effectively gains monopoly, and then the government actually has, so this is where the libertarians are right, the government has an interest to actually protect Jeff Bezos now, even though he's supposed to be an independent business person that's supposed to be subjected to free market forces, like he can fail or succeed, but in actuality, that's not really how it works. Right, so all these pure capitalist guys that are like, oh, well, we should just let the poor people die, and if they try to come after us, we'll shoot them in the face. Right? It's a bunch of bullshit. Right? It's not a real reflection of how the society actually works. Because if the society actually worked the way that these pure capitalists want it to work, then it would the only people that would even own anything would be the top 0.00001% of people, right? Because all the profits flow upwards, and they're the only people that don't have to spend all their money, right? So anyway, we can see from this that there's a lot of secret dealings going on. The government will say one thing to your face and do the exact opposite, knowing that they planned to do the exact opposite before they even told you that they were going to do what you wanted them to do. And that's premeditated. That makes it 10 times worse. It's not just like, oh, well, I was good natured and I said I was going to fix the environment, but then when I got in office, I found out. It's like, no, you knew from the beginning that you were never going to fix the environment. Then you said you were going to do it. That's premeditated. It makes it worse. So, all right, I'm going to get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. Other than that, have a good day and peace.